industry is also mourning the loss of Andre Harrell. He's credited with discovering Sean P. Diddy Combs and is the founder of Uptown Records.
Kim is dead. Heavy D is dead. Andre Harrell is dead. The only two left are Puffy and Al almost died. Isn't that interesting?
I think that Puff is, like many of us, is a work in progress.
we never stop being that, though.
No, you always are who you are. It just gets amplified by your success.
On a quiet night in May 2020, the man who built the blueprint for hip-hop soul took his last breath in a West Hollywood home. And hours later, the internet didn't mourn him. They turned him into a conspiracy theory. Andre Harrell was the architect behind Uptown Records, the executive who signed Mary J. Blige when she was just a mall booth dreamer, and hired a 19-year-old intern named Sean Puffy Combs, only to fire him 3 years later and watch him build an empire that would eclipse everything Harrell ever touched.
This is a guy, he can make videos, he can style. So I started to branch out in the movies and the television. So then Puff wouldn't really listen to anybody but me.
Back in 1992, he brokered a $50 million deal with MCA that made him one of the most powerful black executives in the game. The kind of man who could walk into a boardroom in a tailored suit and walk out owning half the masters. But by the time he died of heart failure at 59, most folks knew him as the guy who discovered Diddy, not the mogul who taught an entire generation that the hood and high fashion could live in the same frame. This is the story of Andre Harrell, the man who made the machine, then got left behind by it.
When I fired him, it was like I had an artist in the building, right? Because Puff, as an executive, he really is a very artistic guy.
But before the machine, before the empire, there was just a kid from Harlem with a microphone and a dream that didn't quite fit. In the early 80s, Andre Harrell was half of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a rap duo with Alonzo Brown that scored club hits like Genius Rap and got them just enough attention to feel the rush of being on stage. They had energy, they had bars, they had the Bronx behind them, but somewhere between the studio and the spotlight, Andre felt it. That quiet voice telling him he wasn't built to chase applause, he was built to build the people who got it. While other rappers were hungry to be the name on the marquee, Andre was watching how the deals got done, how the rooms got controlled, how the real power sat behind the glass with a pen and a handshake. In 1983, he walked into Def Jam and met Russell Simmons, the man who would teach him that being the boss meant more than being the star. Simmons handed him a desk, a Rolodex, and access to the blueprint, how to sign talent, how to negotiate with distributors, how to move like you own the room even when you're still learning the game. Within 2 years, Andre rose to vice president and general manager at Def Jam, becoming one of the youngest black executives in hip-hop at a time when most folks didn't even know that job existed. He learned that you could love the culture without needing to be the face of it, that there was a different kind of legacy in making stars instead of being one. By 1986, he was ready to prove it. MCA came calling with a joint venture offer, real money, real resources, and the freedom to build a label that looked like his vision, not theirs. Andre left Def Jam and formed Uptown Records, a label designed to show the world that black excellence didn't have to choose between the streets and the penthouse, that you could be hood and high fashion in the same breath. While other labels were still trying to figure out if hip-hop was a fad, Andre was already building the sound that would revive R&B and birth a generation of moguls who learned the game by watching him move. That vision wasn't just fashion, it was a statement, a blueprint for what Uptown Records would become: polished, aspirational, and unapologetically black. In 1987, Andre dropped the Uptown is Kickin' It compilation and Heavy D and the Boys' debut album, Living Large. The name wasn't just clever, it was the mission statement. Heavy D came through in designer leather, gold chains over tailored blazers, rapping with a swagger that said you could love hip-hop and still want the penthouse view. That album went gold, moving over 300,000 copies and proving that audiences were hungry for something Uptown was the first to package: the fusion of street credibility and luxury. The sound of folks who came from nothing but refused to dress like it. By 1988, Al B. Sure took that formula even further. His debut in Effect Mode became Uptown's first platinum record, selling 3 million copies and establishing the label as more than a hip-hop experiment. It was a movement. Andre described his artists as performers, draped in stylish clothing and surrounded by luxury, representing the aspirational good life that young black people dreamed about, but rarely saw reflected back at them on MTV or in the pages of industry magazines. Uptown wasn't trying to be gritty for the sake of authenticity. It was saying you could be from the block and still want the finer things. That ambition and elegance weren't betrayals of blackness, they were extensions of it. And then came the mall demo that would change everything. In 1988, a cassette tape started circulating through Uptown's offices. A teenage girl named Mary J. Blige singing Anita Baker's Caught Up in the Rapture in a Yonkers Mall recording booth. Her voice raw and churchy and desperate all at once. Andre heard it and knew immediately. This was the sound he'd been chasing, the bridge between hip-hop edge and R&B soul that nobody else had figured out how to build. He signed her on the spot and began developing what would later be called hip-hop soul, a genre that didn't exist until Uptown made it undeniable. Music journalist Barry Michael Cooper would later explain it best. Before Uptown, you either loved Run DMC and LL Cool J, or you loved Luther Vandross and Anita Baker. There was no in-between. Andre Harrell built that in-between, and in doing so, he didn't just launch careers, he revived R&B itself. But Uptown wasn't just building stars, it was building a pipeline. And in 1988, a 19-year-old intern named Sean Combs walked through the door, hungry enough to change everything. Sean Combs didn't walk through that door looking for a job. He walked in looking for an empire, and Andre Harrell saw it in him the second they locked eyes. Puff was 19, fresh out of Howard University, with the kind of hunger that made him show up early, stay late, and move through the Uptown offices like he already owned them. Andre didn't just give him intern duties, he gave him real A&R power, trusting him to shape the image and sound of Heavy D, Father MC, and a group of church boys from North Carolina called Jodeci, who would redefine what R&B could look like when it stopped being polite. Puff had instincts Andre recognized because they mirrored his own. The belief that black music could be raw and refined at the same time, that you could sample hip-hop beats under gospel vocals and make something the radio couldn't ignore. In 1991, Andre executive produced Strictly Business, a film starring Tommy Davidson and Halle Berry that extended Uptown's brand beyond music and into Hollywood, proving that the label wasn't just a record company, it was a multimedia empire in the making. And then, in 1992, the vision Andre had been building since that mall booth demo finally crystallized. Mary J. Blige's What's the 411 dropped, with Puff overseeing much of the production and styling, and it went triple platinum. She became the queen of hip-hop soul overnight, and the sound Andre and Puff built together. Hip-hop beats, R&B melodies, street fashion, and raw emotion became the blueprint every label in America would try to copy. That same year, Andre closed the deal that would change his life. A 7-year, $50 million partnership with MCA that made Uptown Entertainment a co-owner of its own masters, splitting profits 50-50 with the corporate giant, and giving Andre the kind of financial power and creative control most black executives could only dream about. The LA Times called it one of the most significant deals in the industry, and Andre told them he now ran a black entertainment company that can take an artist from ground zero to the stars, across music, TV, and film. He was 32 years old and had more leverage than Russell Simmons, more vision than any suit at MCA, and a protege who was starting to outshine him in the rooms that mattered. By 1993, Uptown was untouchable. MTV's Unplugged special featured the entire roster: Jodeci, Mary J. Blige, Heavy D, Father MC, Christopher Williams, and Jodeci's live cover of Lately hit #1 on the R&B chart and climbed to #4 on the Hot 100. The performance was electric, raw, and undeniable. The kind of moment that proves a label isn't just hot, it's defining the culture. But behind the scenes, the tension was building. MCA executives were nervous about the content Puff was pushing, especially the Notorious B.I.G.'s debut that Puff wanted to release under Uptown, and whispers started circulating about Puff's disruptive energy, his hunger to move faster than the corporate machine could handle. Andre started to feel it in meetings, in the way Puff would pitch ideas that sounded less like suggestions and more like declarations, in the way the younger artists gravitated toward Puff's vision instead of his. It wasn't jealousy. It was the realization that the student he'd built was becoming bigger than the room they were sharing. And in 1993, inside a cluttered Uptown office, Andre did what no mentor wants to do. He fired the student who was about to surpass him. The conversation didn't last long, maybe 10 minutes, maybe less, but it would echo for decades. Andre sat behind his desk stacked with promo CDs and contract drafts, sunlight cutting through the blinds, and told Sean Combs he had to let him go. The official reasons were murky, depending on who told the story. MCA was nervous about the raw, violent content in the Notorious B.I.G.'s debut that Puff was championing. Corporate suits were complaining about his disruptive energy in meetings, and there were whispers about office politics that had gotten too loud to ignore. Years later, Andre would reframe it with a mentor's wisdom, saying in the documentary Can't Stop, Won't Stop, that he fired Puff only to make him rich, like it was always part of some grand design, some tough love strategy to force his protege toward greatness. But in that moment, with Puff staring at him across the desk, it didn't feel like strategy. It felt like survival, like two alphas realizing the room wasn't big enough for both of them anymore. Puff would later tell interviewers that getting fired from Uptown was one of the best things that ever happened to him, that it forced him to stop being an employee and start being an empire. Within months, he launched Bad Boy Records, took Biggie with him, and began building the sound that would dominate the rest of the 90s. Harder, faster, flashier, more unapologetically commercial than anything Uptown had done. The Notorious B.I.G.'s Ready to Die went multi-platinum. Then came Mace, then Faith Evans, then Total. Each release cementing Bad Boy as the new blueprint, the new standard, the new name that defined hip-hop soul, even though Andre had invented it first. And slowly, the narrative began to shift. Music journalists stopped calling Puff Andre Harrell's protege and started calling Andre the man who discovered Diddy. Like his entire legacy could be reduced to one hiring decision, one mentorship, one firing that turned into folklore. The sound Andre built, the fusion of hip-hop beats and R&B melodies, the aesthetic of luxury and street credibility living in the same frame, was now credited to the student, not the teacher, to the brand on the champagne bottles and the shiny suits, not the man behind the glass who'd mapped it all out first. Bad Boy became the empire Uptown could have been, and for Andre, the question wasn't whether he made the right call, it was whether anyone would remember he made the call at all. But Andre wasn't the type to disappear quietly. Not yet. In 1995, he made a move that looked like redemption on paper. Polygram offered him the CEO seat at Motown Records, the most iconic black music label in history, in a deal reportedly worth around $20 million. It should have been the coronation, the moment where the kid from Harlem who built Uptown got to sit at the table Berry Gordy built and bring the legacy into a new era. Andre walked into those offices with the same vision he'd always had, vowing to bring back real soul music and saying he wanted young artists with old voices that reek of life experience, of pain, the kind of raw, lived-in emotion that made Motown matter in the first place. But magic doesn't work the same way in corporate boardrooms. Andre's style, the gut instincts, the high spending on artist development, the belief that you had to invest in the aesthetic and the vibe before the hits would follow, had worked at Uptown because he co-owned the masters and had MCA as a partner willing to let him cook. At Motown, under Polygram's corporate structure, every dollar was scrutinized, every A&R gamble second-guessed, and Andre's instincts started to look less like vision and more like risk. The hits didn't come fast enough. The market was shifting under his feet. Bad Boy was dominating with Puff's slicker, more commercial sound. Death Row was pushing West Coast G-Funk into the mainstream, and Southern rap was starting to claim its own lane, fracturing the audience that Uptown had once united. By 1997, Polygram had seen enough. The LA Times reported that Andre Harrell had been fired as head of Motown Records after less than 2 years on the job. What made it worse was what came after. Alain Levy, the Polygram executive who'd hired him, didn't stay quiet. In a 1998 interview with the LA Times, Levy called hiring Andre a mistake, saying he was a great A&R man, but that putting him in charge of an entire label operation was an overreach that Andre probably couldn't cope with the demands of the role. Levy alluded to a spendthrift reputation, framing Andre's tenure as a cautionary tale about creative executives who can't handle corporate accountability. The man who built the blueprint was now seen as a cautionary tale, great in the studio, but too wild for the boardroom. And as the industry moved on, Andre quietly disappeared from the headlines. Disappearing from the headlines doesn't mean you disappear from the work. It just means the work happens where the cameras aren't looking. Through the late 90s and into the 2000s, Andre stepped back from the front lines and into the spaces he'd always been most comfortable, behind the scenes, building things that mattered even if they didn't make Billboard. He kept his hand in TV production, maintaining ties to projects like New York Undercover, launched Harrell Records with distribution through Atlantic, and even hosted a radio show, Champagne and Bubbles, on New York's 98.7 KISS FM, where he could talk music, culture, and history with the kind of intimacy that felt more like a conversation than a broadcast. But the quiet years came with a cost the public didn't see. In a televised interview years later, Andre would open up about a health crisis that nearly took him out, a serious infection in his blood that traveled to his heart and required valve surgery, the kind of scare that makes you rethink everything, the hustle, the ambition, the pace you've been running at since you were 19 years old with a mic and a dream. He described it as a turning point, a moment when mortality stopped being abstract and started being a beeping monitor in a hospital room. A moment that reshaped his priorities and made him realize that legacy isn't just what you build. It's whether you're around to see it matter. By the 2000s, Andre had settled into the role the industry seemed most comfortable giving him: elder statesman, godfather, the wise voice who showed up on panels and documentaries to explain how it all started. He worked with Diddy again, this time as vice chairman of Revolt TV, sitting across from his former intern in well-lit studios and trading stories about the Uptown days, laughing about the firing that had once felt so painful and now felt like folklore. He appeared in Can't Stop, Won't Stop, Diddy's documentary about Bad Boy's legacy, where he delivered the line that would define how most people remembered him: "I fired Puff only to make him rich." It was a generous way to tell the story, and maybe it was even true, but it also revealed something quieter, something sadder. Andre Harrell was increasingly being introduced as the man who discovered Diddy, not as the mogul who built Uptown, not as the executive who revived R&B, not as the architect of a sound that still echoes through every hip-hop soul album made today. He had stepped out of the spotlight, but his fingerprints were everywhere, on every Bad Boy hit, every hip-hop soul album, every artist who learned that the hood and high fashion could share the same frame. But on May 7th, 2020, those fingerprints would finally get traced back to their source, not through celebration, but through sudden, shocking loss. Andre Harrell died at home in West Hollywood at age 59, his heart finally giving out after years of quiet struggle with the same organ that infection had damaged all those years before. His ex-partner Wendy Kretel would later confirm to the New York Times that he had suffered from heart problems for some time, that heart failure was the cause, that this wasn't sudden even if it felt that way to everyone who loved him. The world was still locked down from the pandemic, still processing grief in isolation, and the news broke not through a press release, but through whispers on Instagram Live during one of DJ D-Nice's legendary quarantine sets. Within hours, the tributes started flooding in. Diddy posted a lengthy, raw message on Instagram, his voice breaking as he scrolled through old videos of Andre, replaying a pre-Grammy speech where he'd honored his mentor in front of the industry that had watched them both rise. "I can't even handle this," Diddy wrote, calling Andre his big brother, his father figure, the man who believed in him when he was just a hungry kid from Howard with more ambition than sense. He told his followers he hoped they would all be blessed enough to find someone who loves and believes in them the way Andre believed in him. And for once, the tribute felt less like branding and more like grief. John Legend posted that Andre had such a huge influence on the R&B and hip-hop my generation grew up loving, crediting him with signing and mentoring great artists and helping to shape the culture. Usher called him the beginning for so many and saluted him as king, emphasizing that through everything, the wins, the losses, the corporate battles, Andre had remained a genuine positive energy. Mary J. Blige, the mall booth dreamer he'd turned into the queen of hip-hop soul, attended his funeral alongside L.A. Reid and Mariah Carey, a star-studded farewell that proved how deeply his influence ran through the industry's most powerful circles. But the most heartbreaking tribute came from the person who knew him best. On May 13th, Andre's son, Gianni, broke his silence with an Instagram post that went viral across black media outlets, describing his father as my superhero, life coach, personal comedian, twin, yoga partner, wingman, and best friend. He thanked Andre for showing him and his mother that life is all about leaving this earth better than how we find it, and said they were both proud of the man he was, the legacy he built, the love he gave. It was the kind of tribute that reminded everyone that before Andre Harrell was a mogul or a mentor or a cautionary tale, he was a father, a son, a person who loved and was loved deeply. But within hours, the internet did what the internet does. It turned grief into conspiracy. Within days, Reddit threads and YouTube videos started bundling Andre's name with Kim Porter, Heavy D, and others who'd been close to Diddy and died young, weaving narratives about suspicious circumstances and foul play without a single receipt to back it up. The conspiracy machine fed on grief and mistrust, turning a man's documented heart failure into fodder for internet speculation, as if the tragedy of losing someone at 59 wasn't enough without inventing a villain. But here's what the receipts actually say. The New York Times, Variety, CBS News, and multiple other mainstream outlets all reported the same cause of death: heart failure after years of documented heart problems, confirmed by Wendy Kretel, the woman who knew his medical history better than any internet detective ever could. There were no sealed court cases, no mysterious autopsies, no credible journalists chasing a story that didn't exist. Just a man whose heart had been damaged years earlier by infection, whose body finally gave out in the quiet of his own home, the way hearts sometimes do when they've carried too much for too long. The real story, the one that doesn't need conspiracy theories to be compelling, is what Andre left behind. Every time you hear a rapper flowing over an R&B hook, that's Uptown's blueprint. Every time you see a music video where luxury and street credibility share the same frame, that's Andre's aesthetic. Every mogul who wears a tailored suit and talks about coming from nothing, that's the playbook he wrote. Barry Michael Cooper said it best on NPR. Andre Harrell revived R&B by building the bridge between two worlds that were never supposed to meet. And in doing so, he gave an entire generation permission to be hood and high fashion at the same time. The cruelest part isn't that he died too young. It's that he spent his last decade watching other people get credit for the sound he invented, the stars he made, the empire he built with his own hands. He trained Diddy, signed Mary, developed Jodeci, created the Uptown aesthetic, and then watched the culture move on, while his name became a footnote in someone else's documentary. Andre Harrell didn't get the statue or the documentary deal. But every time you hear a rapper over an R&B hook, every time you see a mogul in a tailored suit with a street story to tell, that's him. The man who built the machine, then watched it roll on without his name on it.